Welcome to a deep dive into the book of Ezekiel. We're going all in today, folks, all 48 chapters. And this book is really something else, full of these really vivid images and powerful messages.
A
So,
lot.
yeah.
Definitely a journey through a whirlwind of symbolism. We're
Yeah.
going to see fantastical creatures, divine pronouncements, all these ups and downs from like despair to hope. And
So Ezekiel isn't really like, sitting on the beach reading, right? What's going on back then? Why is Ezekiel doing all this prophesying and what is he even trying to say?
right, so Ezekiel's prophesying during this time when things are really bad for the Israelites. You know, they've been exiled to Babylon, their home's a mess, and their faith is shaky.
Yeah.
So Ezekiel's visions and all these prophecies are supposed to deal with all this mess, confronting their sins, but also like offering a little bit of hope for what's next.
Yeah. It's like he's trying to figure out this whole tragedy thing, finding meaning in all the suffering.
Exactly. And he does this through some of the most striking imagery in the whole Bible. Like right off the bat, chapter 1, where we're thrown into all these supernatural beings and divine encounters. It's a lot to take in.
Oh yeah, the four living creatures. Those guys are definitely not your average angels.
Mhm.
Four faces, four wings, eyes everywhere. It's almost too much. What's the deal with these creatures? What are they all about?
It's all about God's power, God being everywhere, even in exile. So think about those faces. You've got a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. They represent like all these different parts of creation, showing that God's in charge of everything. And the eyes, yeah, they're kind of creepy, but they mean that God sees everything. Nothing gets past him. He knows about their suffering, their sins, and how much they want things to go back to how they were.
Got it. Then there's that whole wheel within a wheel thing. That feels like a metaphor, like it's a symbol for something complicated. I'm not really getting it, though.
Right. It's one of the most debated parts of Ezekiel. Lots of people trying to figure that one out. But most think it represents like how intricate God's plan is, all the details. Even with all this chaos and exile, God's still the one in control. His plan is moving forward, even if the Israelites don't get it.
So it's like there's something mysterious going on behind the scenes, stuff we can't really understand.
Exactly. And then it leads up to this amazing encounter with God. Above these creatures, Ezekiel sees this crystal expanse, and there's this sapphire throne where this human-like figure sits, surrounded by like fire and this brilliant light. And obviously this represents God, all his glory, all his majesty.
Whoa. So how does Ezekiel react to all that?
Pretty much what you'd expect. Overwhelmed. He falls on his face. It's a pretty normal reaction to seeing God in the Bible. It's like admitting how powerful and holy God is, feeling tiny compared to the divine.
I can see that. It's like getting struck by lightning,
Yeah.
something that changes how you see everything.
Hmm.
But God doesn't just leave Ezekiel in awe. He gives him a job, right? A purpose.
Yeah, in chapters 2 and 3, God makes Ezekiel, son of man, a prophet to those rebellious Israelites. But it's not like a nice and easy message. He gives Ezekiel this scroll to eat filled with lamentations, mourning, and woe. Heavy stuff. It's like this powerful symbol of all the hard truths he has to tell them.
Eating a scroll doesn't sound too tasty, but the text says it tastes like honey. What's that about?
Right. It's interesting, for sure. Maybe it means that even when you're saying hard things, telling them about judgment, there's still something good about speaking for God. It's a privilege to be trusted with something so important, even if it's really tough.
So there's a sense of duty, of responsibility, but also knowing God's the one in charge.
Exactly. And God tells Ezekiel straight up. He says, listen, these Israelites, they're not going to be easy. They'll be stubborn. They'll resist. They'll want to do things their own way. But even when they're rebelling, they'll know a prophet's been among them.
Man, it sounds like a thankless job, trying to tell people something they don't want to hear.
It often is. But Ezekiel doesn't just talk. God tells him to do some pretty dramatic stuff, actions that show what he's saying, like a living prophecy.
Right. He draws that city on a tile and then pretends to attack it, like a little version of what's happening to Jerusalem.
Exactly. And in chapter 4, he takes it even further. He lays on his side for days, barely eating, showing how bad the siege of Jerusalem will be, how much the Israelites will suffer.
Wow. That's a powerful way to get your point across, going beyond just words.
And then there's this crazy instruction. God tells him to bake bread with human dung. I know it's shocking, even disturbing, but it shows how desperate and messed up things will be during that siege.
Wait, doesn't he end up using something else? Cow dung instead.
He does. Seems like God let him change it after he protested. It's
Yeah.
an interesting moment. Shows that even in the middle of all this judgment, there's still mercy and compassion.
I see. So it's not just straight up punishment. There's nuance back and forth,
Yeah.
recognizing that we're human, we make mistakes.
Exactly. And this whole idea of judgment with a bit of mercy keeps going in chapter 5. God tells Ezekiel to shave his head and beard and then divide all that hair into 3 parts. Each part represents like what's going to happen to the people in Jerusalem. Some will be burned, some scattered, and some hidden.
So it's like this visual representation of how people's actions have different consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it also hints at this idea of a remnant, those who will make it through the judgment and eventually come back to God.
Right. Even in these dark prophecies, there's this little spark of hope, like not everything's lost.
Exactly. But chapter 6 and 7, man, they paint a pretty bleak picture. It's all God's pronouncements against the Israelites. All their idolatry, the violence, the injustice, and the images, man, they're stark. The land is full of blood, chains are ready for them, and their holy places are about to be destroyed. It's heavy.
It's like this storm about to hit Jerusalem, this feeling of dread, like it's unavoidable.
Yeah. And you really see why God's so angry in chapter 8. Ezekiel sees these elders worshiping idols right there in the temple, where God's supposed to be. It's this awful betrayal, like they've defiled something sacred.
I bet that was a hard thing for Ezekiel to see idolatry happening in the heart of their religion. What's the takeaway from that vision?
It shows just how corrupt they've become spiritually. They've turned away from the one true God. They're looking for comfort and security in things that can't save them. It's a huge warning about what happens when you leave God's path.
And it seems like those consequences are about to hit. Chapter 9. There are these 6 guys with weapons and another guy in linen with an inkwell. What's going on there?
It's a scene of judgment for sure. Chilling, really. The guy in linen, he's supposed to mark the foreheads of those who are like sad about what's going on in the temple. They're the righteous ones, the remnant, those who still believe and are heartbroken by what they see.
So God's separating those who are into this idolatry from those who hate it, right?
Exactly. And that mark on their foreheads, it's like a shield, protection. Because those 6 guys with weapons, they're there to judge everyone who's not marked. It's quick, decisive. God's cleaning out the wickedness.
It's a scary image, but it also shows that God's fair and wants to protect those who are faithful to him.
And then the final straw comes in chapter 10. Ezekiel sees God's glory leaving the temple. It's heartbreaking. God's leaving this corrupted place. It's like he's saying, you made your bed, now lie in it.
Yeah, like, I can't stay here anymore.
That's a good way to put it. And with that powerful exit, we're left to think about what the Israelites did and wonder if they have any hope left.
It's definitely a lot to take in. Visions, pronouncements, all this symbolism. And it all points to Jerusalem getting destroyed. But I have this feeling there's more to the story. What's next in our Ezekiel deep dive?
We're going to dig into more of Ezekiel's warnings, how he uses parables and those symbolic actions. And we'll start to see some glimmers of hope in all this destruction.
So we left off with God's glory just like leaving the temple. That's pretty heavy. It feels like the Israelites are about to get hit hard.
It's a big moment in the book. It's like all their rebellion has led to this, and there's no stopping what's coming. But even as things fall apart, Ezekiel starts to focus on something else. He's giving warnings to specific groups, especially those in charge, the leaders.
So less about what happens to Jerusalem as a whole and more about people being responsible for what they've done.
Right. And we see this in chapter 11. Ezekiel has this vision of the princes of Jerusalem. And these guys, they're plotting against the city. They're acting like everything's fine, even though disaster's right around the corner. They even say, this city is the cauldron and we are the meat. Like they think they'll be safe while everyone else suffers.
That doesn't sound too smart, especially when you're dealing with God. He sees everything. He knows everything.
Yeah, it's a bad move. And they pay for it. One of the princes, Pelatiah, dies right there while Ezekiel's talking. Like, God's making it clear this is serious, don't mess around.
Oh, wow. That's a strong message. Don't underestimate God.
But what about those symbolic actions, like in chapter 12 when he packs his stuff and digs through the wall of his house? What's that all about?
It's one of the most dramatic prophecies. He's acting out, escaping, sneaking away. And it shows what's going to happen, how the Israelites will be forced to leave, exiled to Babylon. It's like he's showing them, look, this is what's coming.
Yeah, not exactly subtle, more like a punch in the gut. Exactly. But even after seeing all that, the Israelites, they they still didn't want to believe. They kept hoping things would be okay, ignoring the prophets.
They really weren't getting it, were they? Speaking of not getting it, what about those false prophets in chapters 13 and 14? They're not helping, are they?
Oh, they're a real problem. God's not happy with them at all. These guys, they're telling comforting lies, making empty promises, acting like they speak for God, but really, they're leading people astray.
Yeah, God even says they're like foxes in the waste places, tearing everything down.
It's a good image, right?
Hmm.
Shows how destructive they are. They prey on those who are, vulnerable, desperate. They give them false hope and pull them away from the truth.
And God says they'll be punished for it. He'll cut them off and they'll have to answer for what they've done. It's like a warning for anyone who tries to twist God's words for their own gain.
Definitely. These chapters are saying if you're going to speak for God, you better be honest and truthful.
Man, this is heavy stuff. Is there any hope at all in this? I'm starting to get weighed down by all the doom and gloom.
Oh, there's always hope. Even in the middle of judgment, Ezekiel never forgets God's love,
Yeah.
how he wants to restore things. And we see this really clearly in chapter 16. There's this long allegory about Jerusalem being like an unfaithful wife.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
intense. It's like saying the Israelites betrayed God.
Yeah, exactly. Jerusalem's unfaithfulness is shown in all these vivid images. Like she has affairs with other nations, sacrifices her children to idols, and she just gets more and more corrupt. It's a powerful message, but it's definitely unsettling.
So God's comparing cheating in marriage to being unfaithful to him,
Yeah.
showing how serious this betrayal is.
Yeah. And there are consequences. Jerusalem will be judged, humiliated, abandoned. But even with this whole cosmic breakup, there's still hope.
So it's not like completely over. They can still fix things with God.
That's what makes this parable so, so powerful. God still loves them. He promises to restore things eventually, but only after Jerusalem really understands what she's done and turns back to him. It's a reminder that God's grace and mercy are always there, even for those who've messed up big time.
It's tough love, right?
Yeah.
God's letting them face the music, but he hasn't given up on them.
Exactly. And then in chapter 17, we get the parable of the two eagles. This one's all about the politics of the time, with eagles and a vine representing different powers like Babylon, Egypt, and even the guy Babylon put in charge of Jerusalem.
So it's about making alliances,
Yeah.
And how dangerous it is to trust in worldly power instead of God.
You got it. The parable's warning them, don't make stupid alliances. True security comes from God, not from some political deal.
Like a spiritual lesson about politics.
Yeah. And this sets up a big shift in the book. In chapter 18, we move away from all these political metaphors and start focusing on personal responsibility.
So now it's less about the nation as a whole and more about each person's choices.
Right. It's like God saying, listen, I deal with each of you individually. And he challenges this idea of inherited guilt, like you automatically inherit your parents' sins.
So it doesn't matter what your family did or what mistakes you made in the past. You're responsible for your own choices.
Exactly. And he really emphasizes this by comparing those who are righteous with those who are wicked. He shows what happens to each. He makes it clear. He wants people to repent, to turn back to him, and he'll forgive them.
It's a hopeful message. No matter what you've done, you can choose a new path.
And then we hear this echoed in chapter 19, but this time it's a lament for the princes of Israel.
Are these the same princes we saw back in chapter 11? The ones who thought they were so safe?
Yep, those guys. But now they're tragic figures, like young lions that have been captured. Their strength and pride are gone because they rebelled against God.
A reminder that even powerful people aren't above God's judgment.
And a warning to anyone who thinks they can get away with disobeying God.
So we've got corrupt leaders, false prophets, and now this whole theme of rebellion coming back. Is there any good news coming?
We'll get there. But first, we got to go through some more tough stuff. In chapter 20, Ezekiel goes all the way back, telling the whole story of Israel's disobedience, starting from their time in the wilderness. It's like a long list of how they rejected God over and over, worshipped idols, broke his laws.
Man, they really didn't learn their lesson, did they? Like a broken record of sin and rebellion.
But even with all this condemnation, there's a little bit of hope. God says he held back his anger, He didn't completely destroy them because of his name, his promises. He hadn't given up on them, even though they kept messing up.
So there's still a chance for them.
Yeah, there is. But there are still consequences. And in chapter 21, things get really intense with this vision of a sword. God's judgment is coming, and it's going to be swift and sharp.
Yeah, I remember that. It's described as, like, made as lightning, ready to kill. Pretty clear message, right?
No messing around here. The sword represents God's judgment, and it's coming soon. Ezekiel even prepares two paths for it, showing that it can't be avoided.
So at this point, there's no escaping judgment. What happens to the people in Jerusalem?
Well, in chapter 22, we get this list of their sins. It makes it clear why this judgment is happening. Bloodshed, idolatry, injustice, treating sacred things like they're nothing. It's a long list.
It's not just a few bad people either.
Right.
The whole city's messed up.
Yeah, Ezekiel points out that even the priests and the princes, the ones who should be setting a good example, are part of the problem. They failed to lead the people, and now the whole society's corrupt.
So it's like a disease, right, spreading everywhere.
Exactly. And to really drive this point home, in chapter 23, we get this parable of the two sisters, Oholah and Oholibah.
Another unfaithful wife story.
Kind of, but it's like double the infidelity this time. Oholah represents Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and Oholibah represents Jerusalem, the southern kingdom's capital.
So both kingdoms messed up. What do they do?
They're like prostitutes, having affairs with the Assyrians and Babylonians, worshiping idols, and doing some really awful things. It's a powerful image of how morally corrupt they are.
I bet the leaders didn't like hearing that.
It was definitely a bold message, calling them out and showing how corrupt both kingdoms had become.
What's the message here? What's the point of all this?
It's a warning to those who are still listening. Turn back to God before it's too late.
So a final call to repentance.
Yeah. And then we get another powerful image in chapter 24 with the boiling pot.
Oh man, that one was disturbing.
Right. Ezekiel takes this pot, fills it with good meat and bones representing the best people in Jerusalem, and boils it over a fire. The rust on the pot is like the sin that's stuck to the city. It shows you can't clean it without some serious judgment.
God's saying, it's so bad, only fire can purify it.
That's a good way to put it. And then, on top of that, Ezekiel's wife dies. God tells him not to mourn publicly, and this becomes another prophetic sign, showing how much the nation will grieve when Jerusalem falls.
It's like even in the middle of all this national stuff, personal tragedies are still happening. It adds this whole other level of sadness. So we're ending this part with judgment coming for sure, heartbreak and loss. What's next?
We're moving towards the end of this prophetic story. Judgment turns into hope, despair into restoration, and we start to see this vision of a future where God's present again. It's like a new beginning.
We've been through a lot, huh? All this judgment, these pronouncements. It's been pretty intense. So what happens now in these last chapters? Is there any good news at all?
Yeah, things are changing. We're moving from all that judgment to restoration. But first, there's this little detour. Chapters 25 through 32, Ezekiel starts giving these prophecies against all the nations around Israel: Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, even Egypt.
So it's like payback time. God's taking care of all those who messed with his people.
It's not really about revenge, it's more about justice. God's showing that he's in charge of all nations, not just Israel. He's holding them accountable for what they've done, all their pride and cruelty.
It's like God cares about what's right everywhere, not just in one place.
Exactly. And it's interesting that even those really powerful empires like Tyre and Egypt, they get judged too. It shows that all that worldly power doesn't last. No one, no matter how strong they think they are, can stand against God.
That's a pretty humbling thought. But what about Israel? Are they just like watching all this happen?
Nope, not at all. In chapter 33, Ezekiel gets a new job. He's the watchman now.
A watchman, like someone standing guard, looking out for danger.
Exactly. He's like a spiritual watchman for Israel. His job is to warn them about danger, to call them to repent, to turn back to God. And it's a serious job. If he doesn't warn them and something bad happens, it's on him.
That's a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But it shows how important prophets are, They have to speak up, tell the truth, even when it's hard.
Right. And it's not just about the prophet speaking. It's also about the people listening. There are consequences for both, for not warning and for not listening.
So both sides have to do their part.
Yeah.
But what's Ezekiel, the watchman, what's he saying now? Are the Israelites even listening at this point after everything that's happened?
Well, in chapter 34, God starts talking about another problem: bad leadership. He calls out the shepherds of Israel, the ones in charge. He says they're exploiting the people, not taking care of them.
So not just prophets, but kings, priests, anyone who's a leader.
Yeah, all of them. God says they're acting like wolves, not shepherds. They're just looking out for themselves, not the people they're supposed to be leading.
It's like that happens all the time, right? People abusing their power, not doing their job.
It's a timeless problem, and God says he's going to step in. He'll be the true shepherd. He'll gather his people, take care of them, and make things right again.
So God's going to fix what the human leaders messed up.
That's the idea. And there's even this hint of a future king, a good king like David, who will take care of the people. It's like a promise of a better future.
Finally, some good news. But what about chapters 35 and 36? Something about Edom and Israel being restored. How does that fit in?
Those chapters show the difference between judgment and restoration. God judges Edom. They were happy when bad things happened to Israel. They took advantage of them. Edom's like the opposite of compassion.
So God judges those who are cruel, even if they're not his people.
Right. And these chapters also show how God's judgment on Edom is different from his promise to restore Israel. The land will be cleansed, the exiles will come back, and God will bless them. It's all about renewal.
It sounds like more than just like fixing the land. It's like a spiritual renewal, too.
Exactly. God says he'll give them new hearts, a new spirit. It's like a fresh start, a new relationship with God.
That's beautiful. But one of the most powerful images of restoration is that valley of dry bones, right, in chapter 37. That one's always stuck with me.
Yeah, it's one of the most hopeful parts of the Bible. Ezekiel's in this valley full of dry bones. It's like a picture of how hopeless things are for the Israelites. They're scattered, defeated, lost.
It's like the ultimate image of despair. A whole nation turned to dust.
Right. But then God tells Ezekiel to speak to the bones, and as he's talking, the bones start moving, coming together. Flesh grows on them. They start breathing. It's like this amazing resurrection.
It's like God can bring life out of death, hope out of nothing. What does it mean for the Israelites?
It's a promise. God's telling them, even though things seem hopeless, I can bring you back. Trust me. Believe in me. There's a future for you.
Wow. That's a powerful message of hope. But then we get chapters 38 and 39. It's like there's this new threat, a final battle before everything's restored. What's up with Gog and Magog?
They're like this last test, one last attempt by evil to mess up God's plan. Gog of Magog, he gathers this huge army to attack Israel. It's like all the forces of chaos and destruction trying to stop God's kingdom.
So it's the ultimate battle, good versus evil.
You could say that. But God wins, of course. He defeats Gog and his army, cleanses the land, and sets up his kingdom forever.
It's like this reassurance that God's in control, that he'll win in the end. But what happens after that? What's the final picture Ezekiel gives us?
Well, the last few chapters 40 through 48, they show us this amazing future for Israel. Ezekiel sees this new temple. It's bigger, better, more magnificent than the one that was destroyed.
It's like God's giving them a major upgrade. A new start.
Exactly. This new temple, it's like a sign that God's presence is back. It's the center of worship and holiness, a place where God and people can meet.
And there's this river flowing from the temple too, right?
Yeah. It's this powerful image of God's life, his blessing flowing out from the temple, healing the land, and going even further.
It's beautiful. God's love and mercy are for everyone.
Wow.
So what's the final takeaway from Ezekiel? What's the last thing he wants us to remember?
The very last verse sums it up. The name of the city from that day shall be, the Lord is there. God's presence will be with them, always, in their lives, their city, their nation.
It's a great ending to this book. It's been a wild ride, judgment, despair, but then hope, restoration, and this promise that God's always with us.
Ezekiel shows us that even when things are really bad, God's working, bringing justice, offering mercy, and bringing his people back to him.
It's a message that still means something today. It gives hope to those who are hurting, who are searching, who are looking for a fresh start. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Ezekiel. We hope it's challenged you, given you hope, and maybe even inspired you on your own journey.